This is your final week of study. Next week, we just tie everything together with a nice big bow. This week, your content is advocacy. Now, you're seeing this video, which means that you completed the pretest. Thank you. Congratulations. And now, keep this big question in the back of your mind. Why did I bring advocacy into this class? It's not in parish. Why did I devote an entire week to the idea of advocating for our English language learners? Let me begin by defining who an advocate is. Advocacy is defined as the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal, or the act or process of advocating something. Don't you love a dictionary that defines a word by simply using another form of that same word? But in truth, advocate comes from the Latin advocatus, which means lawyer. And in the Romance languages, the word for lawyer comes from that Latin root. So in French, it's avocat, and in Spanish, it's abogado. These beautiful birds on the right are avocets. This one was photographed by my brother in Europe, and the bottom one is our beautiful American avocet. And they get their name because they look like they're wearing a hooded robe, like you might see in a courtroom in Europe. You're going to read chapter 1 of a book by Diane Stair-Fenner about advocating for adult English language learners. And she defines advocate as a representative of others who cannot effectively represent themselves. That is a perfect definition going forth into this week's content. What are we advocating against? Well, a lot. Institutionalized and hidden biases and discrimination that comes in all forms: racism, culturalism, sexism, ageism, religious intolerance, which we're seeing these days, xenophobia, which is rampant right now. There's certainly privilege that can drive discrimination. Gender identity is another area where students can feel discrimination. And we need to be aware of the hidden biases. We'll often see this in advertising and how people are stereotyped in TV shows and movies. Words matter. How we talk about people is driven by how we think about them, and how we think about them drives how we treat them. This is a photo from the caravan that's coming through Mexico from Honduras right now. And here are some ways these people have been defined in the media lately. Criminals and unknown Middle Easterners, very bad thugs and gang members, invasion, infestation. All of these are from our president. The last one was a Fox News reporter who said, these people are just bringing diseases like smallpox and leprosy to infect Americans. Now forget about the fact that smallpox was wiped out decades ago around the world. All of this hateful rhetoric is meant to drum up fear of the other, to make Americans afraid of these brown people coming up from Mexico, rather than talking about them in terms of who they really are. How we talk about them matters. Do we see them as people? Or do we see them as an infestation that needs to be locked up? We're not meeting the needs of the people who come here, immigrants, and of the adults born in the United States. We've got 36 million adults in the US who can't read, write, or do math above the 3rd grade level. Children of parents with low literacy skills are far more likely to grow into adults with low literacy skills. We spend $232 billion a year in healthcare costs directly attributable to low literacy. 75% of adults in prison are low literate. 50% of the 2 million immigrants who come here every year are not proficient in English, and 4% of the adults in this country who need adult ed services are actually getting them. Think about education as a fight for social justice. This top quote was from Arne Duncan, who was our Secretary of Education under President Obama. And it's a lovely quote, but I love the last part of it. Great teaching is about so much more than education. It's a daily fight for social justice. And then from Howard, which you are going to read this week, the development of culturally relevant teaching strategies is contingent upon critical reflection about race and culture of teachers and their students. Think about Paulo Freire, who said that education is the practice of freedom, and that the educator has the duty of not being neutral. I would like to introduce you to Sabah. Now, this is not really Sabah, it's a stock photo, but Sabah was my level 2 student. She was from Algeria. She spoke 3 languages. She spoke Arabic and French fluently, and she was in my class to learn English. Now, Sabah was working at Safeway, and she got a job as a cashier, and her English was good enough that they asked her to help out at the customer service desk. And one time, a lady came to the desk with a problem, and Sabah was trying to help her. And the woman yelled at her. She said, "You immigrants, why don't you bother to learn English?" Now, think of for a moment, what is the impact of that? If you were Sabah, how would you feel in that moment? For this woman, she probably didn't give it another thought. For Sabah, it colored her world for weeks. Immigrants who suffer verbal attacks like this feel isolated, they feel unwelcome, all of these horrible emotions. Let me go back to that. All of these emotions flooded over Sabah, and she came into my classroom in tears. She told me this story, but instead of a weapon, I gave her tools. I taught her to practice. I am learning English, and I'm working hard, and you could help me instead of criticizing me. More than 10 years later, Sabah is still at Safeway. She's a shift manager, and she is completely fluent and literate in English. We want to advocate for the rights of these immigrants to seek out an education, for a job, and have a better life for their families. We want to advocate for the rights of people to be treated with respect and dignity, and we want them to be treated with understanding and empathy. There's a lovely Indian proverb that says, "Don't judge a man until you have walked 2 moons in his moccasins." Practice your elevator speech. The next time someone complains about immigrants and how they don't bother to learn English, or how they're not fluent in English, ask them, when was the last time you went to live in another country or culture where you had to do any of these things that are necessary to live in a foreign country? To learn the completely different language and maybe a completely different alphabet, to learn the money, to negotiate your rent, to buy the food you need, to find a job, to find your way around town. I think you will find that most of the people who complain about immigrants not knowing English have never done any of these things. Immigrants are often the victims of identity theft and scams. So it's really important to help teach them how to avoid those, to find out who they go to for help, and how to stand up for themselves. There's also this scam of the notario scam. So in Mexico, a notario can fill out immigration papers for you. They are a form of lawyer. But in the US, a notary is not a lawyer. But there are lots of notaries in the US that take advantage of this confusion, and they will charge immigrants hundreds, even thousands of dollars to fill out legal documents that they are not legally authorized to fill out. So be their cheerleader. Fight for equity in education, social perception, sticking up for the underdog, their physical and learning disabilities, their language minorities. Help them recognize their process. Share their test scores with them, share rubrics and grading criteria, celebrate their victories, and help them learn to advocate for themselves, to be independent. This document is part of your assignment this week, the 5 steps to ELL advocacy. But these are the 5 steps. You isolate the issue, you identify your allies, Be clear of the rights of the students. You organize and educate others, and you identify your outlets for change. What can you do in the classroom, your school, your district, your community, and how do you collaborate with others? Think about who is in your classroom. Remember who they are. The ugly truths in America: we have African American and Latino students are the largest ethnic groups in K-12 schools, but the academic underachievement of those students is still abysmal across the country. Now, currently, those two groups are 28% of K-12 populations, but they are 50% of students labeled as mentally retarded, 40% of students labeled developmentally delayed, and 37% of students labeled emotionally disturbed. This means that students in K-12 who need English language instruction are being wrongfully directed into programs for people with mental deficits. Their language diversity has been seen as a deficit, and it's driven K-12 for years. And traditional education has reflected primarily white middle-class values. What we need is culturally relevant pedagogy, critical teacher reflection that can ultimately measure the teacher's levels of concern and care for the students, that we teach to and through the strengths of those students, that it's culturally validating and affirming. And remember that students bring cultural capital to the classroom. You could be working with a very diverse population of students. You never know who's going to be in your classroom. You don't always know who needs an advocate. So you need to listen to their stories and make sure they know it's safe to talk to you. Equality is not the same as equity. Equality in education means everybody gets the same book. Equity in education means everybody has access to the same education. This means that we don't provide the same test to all students if it's not in their skill set to take that test. What if you're teaching overseas? You may have a limited voice. You may be living in a culture where you would stand out as interfering. In China, for example, you do not speak out against the system in any way, but you can still teach equitably. Know the laws of where you go to teach overseas, know the school's policies, communicate with your department to find out what the options might be for a student who needs some help. What are the expectations of your job? What are the consequences of being seen as stepping out of bounds and interfering? You can lead by example, but choose your model carefully. Be sure it doesn't set unfair expectations on the part of the students. And beware of prejudices against you as a foreigner. You might need to grow a pretty thick skin. This week, you're going to do some readings and watch some videos and read some data from the UN Commission on Refugees, and take an internal bias test and think about how bias affects the English language learners in your classrooms. Here are some references for this video. Now you are ready to go forth and learn more about advocating for your English language learners. Thank you. See you next week. Bye-bye.